Welcome to the Boston Globe's Black History Month Film Festival. I'm Megan Irons. I'm a reporter here at the Boston Globe, and I'm happy to be leading this afternoon's conversation about the new documentary film, Code Switching, Race and Identity in the Suburban Schoolhouse. The film is airing on World Channel and public television stations across the country. It chronicles the experiences of three generations of Black Bostonians in the school integration program called the Metropolitan Council for Educational Opportunity, or as we all know it, METCO. Through the program, students are shuttled from urban centers in Boston to predominantly suburban communities many, many miles away from their homes in pursuit of a better education. But as the film exposes, students often find themselves navigating vastly different worlds, delicately balancing what it means to be Black in an urban community versus what it means to be Black in a suburban school. Navigating culture and class proved difficult, and in some cases, it was traumatizing. Some of the experiences were enriching, but other experiences were soul crushing. Today, I'm happy and delighted to have filmmaker Mike Mescal join us to discuss his work and the broader message woven into this film. He's the founder of Lev Media Group and specializes in documenting invaluable chapters in Black history. His first film, On the Line, tackled one of the longest voluntary desegregation programs in the country and its historical impact in Boston. Also joining us is Umelani Malaba Adebo, a consultant on the film. She's an artist, a parent, and an educator who taught in the Boston Public Schools. I want to thank you both for being here today and for joining me in this conversation. And I'm sorry about the flub in the beginning. I want to also
Thank you.
note that the director, Jonathan Schwartz, was expected to join us, but he could not be here today because of an unexpected conflict. I also want to welcome our audience. Thank you all for being here. We love you. We want to spend some time talking with Mike and you, Milani, but then I'll get to your questions. So please use the Q&A tool to pose your questions, and I'll do my best to get to them as soon as possible. I also want to remind you that this event is being recorded and will be distributed later. So let's get to let's get started that conversation. Mike, I want to start with you. Your first film, On the Line, explored the torturous legacy of Boston's effort to desegregate city schools. Now you're out with Code Switching, which focuses on several generations of students in the METCO program. Describe for those who are listening and who don't know, what is Code Switching and why did you decide to make a film about it?
Well, first of all, thank you, Megan, for having me on today's Zoom, and hello to the Boston community. I'm certainly hoping that everyone is warm and safe up there. I'm in New York, but I'm still a Bostonian at heart. Um, Code switching. So, I mean, there's the technical terms for code switching that we're familiar with. The process of shifting from one linguistic code, a language or a dialect, to another, depending on the social context and the conversational settings. You know, um, Speakers switch all the time from one code to another, either to show solidarity with a social group, to distinguish oneself, to participate in social encounters and such. For the sake of this film and narrowing that scope down, we're really talking about the practice of alternating and shifting between two or more languages and behavior and cultural mores, just to kind of fit in environments that you're not normally comfortable with or don't necessarily spend a great amount of time in. Why code switching? I guess the original film On the Line. There are a lot of themes that came through in that film. Themes about early sacrifice, the parents and activists in the community, and the efforts that they put forth to get the program off the ground in the early years. Um, Lessons learned from participants in the program. And one of the key themes that was very consistent from my era, the '60s, the '70s, the '80s, right up into current, is the fact that we all continue to a degree, code switch.
Mhm.
as a matter of survival. So, because it was such an important theme, it required its own attention in a separate film. It also gave us an opportunity to take a deeper dive into the real impact on the students themselves, both who are in the current program today, as well as just reflecting back on the experiences of those that have gone through that same experience.
Uma Laney, you consulted on the film. You worked with Jonathan Swartz, the director. Talk
Yes.
about how your ties, you're a very connected person in the city, and talk about your community ties and how that played into your decision to be involved with this project.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for Boston Globe and for you for the introduction. Um, I think for me, one of the reasons why I wanted to be involved in the project was because it's something that not only do I personally experience it in different ways, but as a teacher, as someone who taught in the BPS through my work at the time in public health, I basically was front and center in seeing that through my students. And then subsequently going into higher education, I saw my students shift from going through that experience in high school. And then on the other side, when they were in college, sort of a continuation of sort of the survival tactics in which they needed in order to navigate. And so I was very interested in being involved in that capacity because, as Mike echoed, it's something that we all do in different ways, but also they looks differently now based on what's going on in the world. The other thing I was really interested about is sort of the well-being, the emotional well-being, and the emotional toll that code switching does take on the individuals and the community at large. And so, because this documentary sort of talks about and explores that, I was very interested in being involved in that capacity. And pulling together communities, or at least trying to get connected to communities who would really want to hear the story, had something really visceral to say about the experiences on either side, and just create a platform to have this really important conversation.
Mike, your mom graduated from my alma mater, the Burke High School,
Yeah,
and she taught in the Boston public school system as well. And she also put forth for children through Metco as well, Lincoln, Lexington, and Brookline. Um, you went through Metco yourself, right?
absolutely.
And so what was that like, and how did that inform your work with this film?
Well, yeah, so I have a personal involvement because I was personally involved in the program myself. I went to school starting in third grade in Lexington back in 1974, and spent those years through K through 12, getting the full experience. So I have a personal connection to the storyline. But for me, the whole MECO experience, I break it down into a few stages. I think of my early years at the elementary school level, where I was a very shy individual, and I was the center of attention because there just weren't too many black folks in that school system. So anytime anything black or city came up, usually I was the point of focus to be a resource to that suburban community. So, right off the bat, there was a lot of pressure in that regard because here I am, sent out to get a better education, but yet in turn, here I am the one who is a focal point for educating the suburban community on what it's like to be an inner city kid in Boston.
Mm.
As I developed through the secondary level, I felt a little more comfortable. I had a chance to uh, build a little bit of camaraderie through sports. That's when I first started playing sports, and that's when the community has a tendency to embrace you a little bit more. You become part of the local fiber, and all of a sudden, your household name, and things seem to open up a little bit more. But that's not the case with all students. So there are only a handful that actually wind up participating at that level. So the middle school level, I would say transitional, just starting to get a feel for what was possible, in that suburban community and how to navigate. High school, I would kind of describe it as a mixed bag. On one hand, I'm getting a lot more clarity. I'm seeing things for what they really are. both the good and the bad in that environment. There's a certain comfort level that either you expand or you stop in terms of relationships by the time you get through high school. So, the quest for quality education goes well beyond the classroom. It's well beyond what you score in the test. It's how you kind of navigate through that space.
I want to explore the idea, the theme of two worlds, just sort of navigating in these different environments that was very prominent in the documentary. But first, I want to play a short clip and pick up the topic on the other side.
Okay.
Uh,
We are a group of minority students going to these white suburban towns, hoping for a better education.
You leave people with a needle in their arm at 5 o'clock in the morning, ride the rest of the way to bus out to Lexington in your school with a bunch of white kids and white teachers. You would go from the inner city to an affluent school system.
The whole experience gave me one vital thing: how to deal with other people that were different from you.
People have all these stereotypes about us, like when we started beat, expect you to rap, but that just wasn't me.
There was a point where it was like having two Fatimas. I feel like a weird disconnect, like I don't fit in either spots.
When I'm out in Weston, I try to make sure that
I hope you were able to hear that. Were you able to hear?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
In the theme of this whole idea of living in two different worlds is so central in this documentary. Not only were the kids dealing with, going to a suburban schools, leaving their urban environment and going into suburban schools, but they were also dealing with coming back home and feeling somewhat like an outsider as well. And so I wonder if you could talk about how you were able to navigate these different worlds, and what did these students have to give up, for the long-term goal for quality education? What did they have to live with in terms of not really fitting in?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the films, they kind of draw out the predicaments, right? Alienation, side effects faced by the teenage students, adult choices. You really have to make adult choices at a adolescent age pretty early, because you're making decisions in terms of, where you put your resources and efforts, and where you decide to draw the line in terms of where you're going to spend your time. One of the things you do lose as you spend 12-hour days in the suburban community is you obviously become a little more disconnected with your local community in the city. Friends that you might have been growing up with and before you went to school in the suburbs, you tend to drift apart because you're not seeing them until the weekends, if at all. If you're involved in extracurricular activities, that time span even is further. And if you're involved in extracurricular activities in the city as well as the suburbs, then your time schedule is just shot. So that's the first thing. You lose that sense of cohesiveness and closeness to your core. The second thing is this: when you're splitting time between those two different worlds, you're also making some choices, some hard choices in terms of, what do you gravitate to? And it's one thing to be accepted into different clubs or different activities in both environments, but if you're not fully engaged, and if you're not tasked within that organization, you don't really feel like you have a sense of belonging. So there's a difference between just being accepted in different groups versus a true sense of belonging. So that's something that you first struggle with, dealing with the two different worlds. And the other piece is just determining who you are. That whole what we say is the authentic self. You lose a little bit of your authentic self. Do you change to fit in, to be accepted to some degree, or do you hold on to who you are and expect that they'll come around to accepting you as you. Um, it's challenging, and it's not something that everyone handles it in the same way.
And so you, Melania, what in your work as an educator, is this something that you also saw? And how did your students deal with that?
So I mentioned earlier that I taught in the Boston public schools, and oftentimes in the summer I have had done some work with MedCorps as it relates to doing workshops for MedCorps students in the summer. And a lot of the conversations that they would have in these workshops were around echoing what Mike was talking about, this feeling of I don't know how to be myself at home, and I can't really be myself at school, and how do I navigate? And so a lot of that work, at least in the capacity at the time, was around sort of building sort of the muscles for them to be able to be comfortable in their own skin and to be able to advocate for themselves. Now, I certainly understand that on campus, the schools, they do have folks who are there on site to support them and navigate as they navigate in their sort of home schools, which I think is definitely an important resource. But the whole idea of sort of two worlds doesn't only stop at going to school in the suburban. Sometimes just right in your own neighborhood, you go to school and it's a different sort of culture and climate, and that's just 2 or 3 blocks away. So I think those conversations too are important to notice. The other thing too is when we're thinking about two worlds, much of the students, they went to MedCorps as part of sort of legacy kids, in the sense that their parents went to the school, and so they knew about this, and they had been sort of prepped in advance by their parents, and it was something that they knew they were going to be involved in. And in some cases, what I'm told from parents I talked to back then was that they were already on the list before they were even born. Okay, slight exaggeration, but I mean, it's you know, I mean, it was, you know, it's the idea that, you know, this is going to happen because I went to the school. And so you're going to also go to a medical program like I did and get the benefits, and certainly understand that as a parent, you want to do the best for your parents. I mean, for your kids. But at the same time, I think now this two worlds piece has really opened up more because of COVID and its impact on what do these worlds mean. The digital divide that's made us all, work, go to school remotely. That's another layer now of a different world that's sort of adding on to the alienation or sort of the stress of the tug of war in between the two worlds. And so I think there are other layers now in this new era of education that really impacts how our students are then moving in these two worlds and navigating.
I want to explore that a little more. We'll do that a little later, but we talked about the young people, but the parents are also involved. In that clip we just showed, we heard Candace, who went to Weston High School, I believe, who said, why do I have to go so far away to get a high quality education? I mean, that's a question that's being asked right now as we look at our public schools and how they're preparing our students for the future. And so, Melania, I want you to take this on, and then Mike, you can follow. You talk about what parents are dealing with and the calculations that they make in deciding that they should send their kids to school to schools so far away from their communities. Surely they knew, they experienced it, right? That it would not be easy, that there would be a toll. But talk to us about what those calculations are.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd say, that, as a parent myself, it's very difficult to think about, what's the best course of action for your child. I think each parent does the best they can do at the time with the resources and experiences they've had. And I think in my conversations with folks who are graduates of MedCorps school themselves and who are now parents, again, one of the things that they really loved about their MedCorps experience was the doors it opened, the avenues, and the experiences that they wouldn't have had in the city. Now, keep in mind, this was, some years back. So, I mean, we're now in a sort of a different time. And I think some of the experiences that they were hoping to get in the schools, in the suburban schools, I think are now, people can take advantage of that in the Boston public schools. However, not all public schools are created equal, as we all know. But this decision for them to sign up their kids to MEDCO is really one based on them having more opportunities, more exposure than in the city. I will say that, now the decisions to have the students in the schools is really based on the parental involvement and the leadership of the specific school, and how involved and how the dialogue is between the leadership of the school in terms of the Boston Public Schools or local schools being considered vis-a-vis MEDCO program. And of course, with COVID, it's made it very challenging now. A lot of parents I know are really thinking about homeschooling in the real sense, not in sort of the remote learning as we all are now, because of more control. And again, of course, this is based on people's ability and economic ability to do that as well. And so I think with all those decisions, there's the sort of where they are in their lives and sort of what they can do at the time is really important. And also, how many kids they have. I think, I have just one child. And so in terms of what I'd be willing to do and navigate and be able to do is very different if you have multiple kids, that you want to make sure that they get the best opportunities. So I think there's so many challenging factors. But I think now with the upheaval of education, I am curious to see what parents are going to be doing. I mean, in terms of the learning pods that people are creating now and how people are seeing how learning can be different when you have more control as a parent and what your child digests, if you will. So.
And so Mike, I would love for you to answer that, but I also want to throw something else at you, which is that, this whole idea, this quest for quality schools, oftentimes it's put in the context of race. There was another parent in your film that said, all I see is them shuffling, something along the lines, shuffling the Black kids and the white kids, but nobody's talking about the quality of our schools. And so, what have you learned in doing this film? I mean, about MEDCO, should we still have something like this? Is MEDCO doing what it was set out to do? What's the message that you're hoping to send both for MEDCO or for diversity in public schools in general?
Well, yeah, and here I am, a parent with two younger kids, 15 and 13 as well. So these thoughts are going through my mind right now, and what resources are out there and what's in the best interest long term for my kids. But when I think of the MEDCO program and all of its capabilities and what it still has to offer for the next 50 years and beyond, is that it's a choice. It's a choice. And I think for the most part, the way I look at education nowadays and the decisions that parents have to make, there are a lot of other resources that weren't out there, 30, 40 years ago. So the first thing is you have to think of the end, keep the end in mind. What is it that you would like to get accomplished out of the program should you put your kids through the program? I think, the first thing for me, if I was still living in Boston, it would be a matter of, do I want my kids exposed to a more complex world and at an earliest stage? Because I still think you can get a quality education through a lot of different resources. But in terms of MEDCO, the reason why it's still valuable is because it gives you a particular path to get there. And that path is a lot of exposure to things you would not normally be exposed to. You learn how the world works because you're exposed to folks who are making things happen in the world. And that is important. If it's not important early, it'll come back to become important to you at some point in your life, when you're out in the workforce. So in my opinion, better to learn early than late, the good and the bad. It's not necessarily a rosy road that just because you're on a path to a great education, that you're going to be exposed to everything in a positive manner. You're going to learn some things that are going to be a little shocking. You're going to learn some hardships, and you're going to learn that not everybody is in your network or in your lifeboat forever. Right? There'll be those that you have to define as acquaintances, and there'll be those that you define as lifelong friends who can help you out in the pinch, who can get you a job when you need a job. Right? So those are the things you have to think about. There's the education in the classroom, and then there's the education on life. And I think that's what really distinguishes whether or not you think, MECO or that environment is right for your individual kid.
We have a question from the audience, and it says, knowing what you know now, those who have experienced MEDCO programming, what advice would you give your younger teenage selves in regards to navigating challenges while remaining true to who you were? Sorry.
Well, I mean, the first piece of advice I'd give to this generation or my own kids, if I was putting them through the program, is to get involved. First of all, don't be on the outside looking in. I want you to get involved so you can have some impact and have some say and raise your hand in the classroom and be accounted. That's the first thing. If you're going to be in that environment, it does you no good to kind of sit back and just watch other things happen around you. You have to be a part of the process, moving things forward. Secondly, I would tell them right off the bat, it is okay to be yourself. It's okay to be yourself. If others don't appreciate it or find value in it, that's on them. It's not on you. So whatever you do, try to be yourself all the way through and from the beginning. If they like you, they like you because they like you. If they don't like you for the same reason. They don't like you because they don't like you, and that's okay. So just hold on to your authentic self as much as possible and enjoy the journey. But get involved. You have to be involved. One of the disconnects with feedback from both my films, in the first film, one of the characters is talking to the younger generation on the school bus, and she asked them, are you involved in community activities and so forth? And all the girls said no. What they do is at 2:20, when the school day is over, they get on the school bus, they go back to the city, and that's it. That's their only short time frame of being exposed to the community. So that's my one thing. Just get involved.
Do you have any advice, Milani?
Yes, I would say the first thing is say your name. Say your name loud and proud. I think that as kids of color, oftentimes people abbreviate their names or want to do whatever they want with their names. And I think it's important for them to stand firm in who they are, their culture and their name. So I would say that. I would also say try something new. Even if it's something you haven't thought of. If it's like, hey, if there's fencing, do it, try it, see if you like it. You might turn out to be, someone who'll be representing America in fencing. Who knows? Just do something, try something new. And ask questions all the time. No questions, and I find that the students I remember the most are the ones that were inquisitive for knowledge. So asking questions. But I will be sneaky and say that while we're offering these messages to the young people, I'll also have messages to their parents who, as you say, Mike, who chose to put them in the MEDCO system to begin with, is that the parents, to be involved as much as possible. And I know that it's hard because as parents we're working and our schedules, but I think it's really important to try and be involved. And then on the flip side, to the program and the school to really be flexible and amenable to being, providing opportunities for parents to be involved at times and locations that are easy and accessible for them to go to. And whether that means something as radical as providing the buses to get people to come. I'm just saying, maybe it's a little outside the box, but I think by any means necessary, especially because that kids are vacillating in between two worlds. And I think that in conjunction with what we're asking of the kids, I think will really help for the experience to be wholesome.
We have a lot of questions about advice for host families. So if you had to give one piece of guidance or advice for a host family, what would it be? You could start me.
You want to start with me?
Yes, please.
Because I got a list. Let me keep it short.
I'm sure you do, Mike.
Yeah, so here it is in a nutshell. Because the host family program, the way it was structured, it was mandated at the elementary level, but as soon as you got to middle school, it was up to the individuals whether or not they wanted to stay connected, right? And then through high school, God forbid, everyone goes in separate ways. But there's an opportunity for those in the suburb to get more involved at an early level by just engaging more and bringing more exposure uh, by coming into the city and learning equally about each other culturally, spiritually, learning how folks go about their day, even on the weekend. That's important because if you don't physically take the time to come in and do it on your own, you're just basing it on opinion. You're getting somebody else's point of view and not your own. The best thing that everyone can do, and this, I'll clearly say this from my films and talking to folks that I went to school with in the suburbs. They talk about the big miss, that big opportunity that they had. Part of the secondary purpose for METCO was all about the integration experience for the suburban students and giving them a little sense of how to live in a multicultural world. We could still do a lot more to bring those two worlds together and give both sides the opportunity to learn more about one another. So um, huge miss in my era. Hopefully they're starting to turn that curve a little bit.
Mhm.
Mm.
Umalani, I want to take this next question from the audience, which is, what would it take to bring Boston school system standards up so that METCO and code switching wouldn't be necessary? Is there any hope for BPS?
Mm, that's an interesting question. Um, I think the thing about Boston, and again, my experience is as an immigrant coming into Boston, and so my perspective is from that lens, is that having had the experience of teaching at different Boston public schools, I recognize they are unequal in the sense that both the percentage of teachers who are of color, the level of engagement and collaboration between sort of the leadership and the schools are very different. So I would say one of the things that's important is really having a strong parental council in the school. Because I think when you have that and the parental involvement is really strong, it means that you have sort of the ear of the leadership and as such can steer supports and directives as it relates to your child's learning. The second thing I would say is I don't think that code switching can be eradicated. Unfortunately, I do think it requires a breakdown, I would say, in the sort of systemic culture that we have of having people vacillate between two cultures, having people one culture be the dominant culture, and I think we need to break that up in order for us not to be having to even have a dialogue about code switching and this push and pull that often happens with students of color and folks of color. So, but I do think that there is hope. They are schools that are very involved and doing really great work in engaging their students. But I think that we have a lot of work to do. Particularly now with a year or so in remote learning, our students are really falling behind, both emotionally, and I think that is really going to impact sort of how far we have to then move in order to get there. But it takes each one of us. It takes parents, it takes the teachers working together and the communities to really do that.
Mike, we've had an interesting 2020, to say the least. But how has the reception, had the past year affected the reception of this documentary?
Well, I mean, it's gotten a lot of exposure, just because of the subject, not just locally in the Massachusetts community, but nationally. I have the film distributed through a educational film co-op, so it's in reach for all universities across the country as well as K through 12 schools, and they've been reaching out because a lot of them have their own design curriculum around code switching. There's a school I talked to in Florida. The group of kids, they had an organization in the school called uncomfortable conversations around code switching. So it's it's a pretty common theme, very popular theme across the country, and it's good. I think it's starting to get the right attention, and I think that'll help the next generation in terms of how they cope. So we're doing our part.
We don't have a lot of time left, but Umalani, can you talk about, there's another question from the audience on alumni groups for METCO students. Do they exist? And if so, do they help as support systems for these students who are currently in the program?
So we're still in the early stages of rounding up. You know, we've rounded up through the years, but we've been kind of scattered. But I think the new administration is doing a great job of at least putting the information out there so we can register as alumni. We can chime in and participate in any activity, and we also can, you know, add some expertise and some help. So there's an open dialogue and some communication that's starting to move in the right direction in that regard. So if you are alumni, you should be going to the METCO website and registering yourself as an alumni, and starting at that point.
Was one other thing we didn't get to, and I hope we can before our time is up, but the whole idea that some of the lingering, and you both alluded to this in your responses, but some of the lingering impact, you know, Fatima, you know, suicidal attempts. I forget the other young woman's name. Candace, who talked about feeling completely invisible. I mean, and he was talking about it in real time, like it's still impacting her as well. Did you find that it was tougher on the girls than it was on the young men in terms of adjusting and dealing with, you know, these two different worlds, I guess, for just a shorter way of saying that?
You want to take that one, or you?
Oh, sure.
Right
I mean,
ahead.
I think that all of these things sort of live differently. I mean, there's a lot of policing of girls' bodies, from here, and all of those things, and that happen those happen whether you're in the medical program or not. You know, the sort of body image issues certainly are very present in the school system now. And one of the things that I think is important, at least in the documentary that kind of speaks about, is that she decided that she wants to be sort of the response to what she experienced. And it really resonates with me, because that was largely the reason why I wanted to see my students on the other side in higher education, why I started teaching in college, because I wanted to see my students on the other side. I wanted to be that person, that teacher of color, the professor of color on the other side, who could really help with that sort of that disconnect, that invisibility aspect, because when you see someone who looks like you, then there is that validation. And so for me, that was very important to do. And certainly that is what Candace has chosen to do with her life career in terms of turning that around. That dialogue that she has with Fatima really speaks to a lot of the dialogues that girls have in those spaces. And also, you know, the film centers around school, but as you talked about, Mike, and as we've talked about before, it is essentially a preparation for life after and beyond. And so these conversations also happen beyond. But as we know, that there is, you know, there is an unfair, if you will, not advantage, but an unfair sort of invisibility that happens. But I do find that, you know, that they are rising, that they're coming together and doing something about it. Fatima even talks about feeling surrounded, even in spite of going through those painful experiences. She did find community in the friendships there in her school, and she did go to those senior events. So even in those painful experiences, they do find others to congregate and be of support. And I think that's really important for them.
Well, I loved her spirit at the end. You know, she just gave them the deuce.
Yes. Yeah, being authentically herself.
That's right.
I mean, at the end of the day, we shouldn't have to be morphing. In the end of the day, the most important thing is much like we said earlier, which is to be yourself. But that is harder to do if your community isn't sort of backing you, your community, your parents, and your family, and so forth.
Right.
And so
That's right. But I admired the strength and the courage. We didn't even get to Ricky. If you guys have not seen the film,
Yes.
please go out and do so. It's amazing. And I want to thank you. This is a great way of ending on a high note, and a message about being your authentic self and the support that we all need to navigate our many different worlds. So Mike Mescal, thank you so much for this film and bringing it to us and
Thank
for
you.
your time here today. And Dumalani, Malaba Adobo, thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom. And thank you to all of you who have joined us today. I see like 400 questions. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to all of them, but thank you all. And
Thank you very much. It's been a
Thank you very
wonderful
much. One last
afternoon.
note, the film is Thursday night on WGBH in Boston. So to your local community, if you want to view the film, it'll be on TV Thursday night, this Thursday, 9 o'clock.
thank you.
Okay, awesome.
All right, good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.